Hey, everybody, and welcome to the brand called you. So I love December in New York because there's so much music going on, choral music, caroling. But I mean, by far, my favorite thing to do of all is go to midnight mass. I'm not Catholic. In fact, I'm a Jewish girl. Maybe that's why I like it so much because it's so relaxing. There's no guilt associated with it, no religion. I just love the pure music. And every year I try to go to a different mass. But I have to say, when I think back, my favorite of all was not one of the big churches like St. Patrick's. It was a small, wonderful gospel church in Brooklyn called the Brooklyn Tabernacle Church. I went there about 15 years ago with my father, and we had the best time. The music was incredible. And it's funny because I had no idea that it was actually my next guest that I'm going to introduce that was largely responsible for that sound. So our guest today is David Kahn. He is, believe it or not, an acoustical engineer. I know not everybody realizes that they're the magic behind the sound, but he is. In fact, he's been doing this since I think 1983. He's one of the founding principals of Acoustic Distinctions, which is an acoustical design company. And really, since all of those decades ago, he helps institutions and performing arts centers, theaters, museums, libraries, whatever you can imagine, whatever space you can imagine. He's kind of the secret quiet force behind helping them get a beautiful sound. He also teaches on the faculty of Rensselaer Polytechnical Institute to architecture students. He's taught at the Yale Drama School. And his handiwork is everywhere. So many, in fact, that I can't even describe them here. So many famous music halls and schools and institutions, but I'll let him speak for himself. So welcome, David. It's really a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Lisa.
Yeah. I mean, of course, I think of you during this time when every building you go into is just pumping filled with sound. And, it's just something we don't normally think about, that there is actually a whole engineer that's secretly behind the scenes doing this kind of work. I mean, I'm sort of fascinated by this. I'm curious, like, what in the world got you into this to begin with?
Well, I was fortunate that my parents introduced me to music at a very young age. Also, back then, music was part of the curriculum at the public elementary school I attended in New Rochelle, New York. So I remember going to one of the school assemblies in third grade and hearing a jazz band, and they had a trumpet player, and I came home and said, that's what I want to do. I want to play the trumpet. And trumpet playing has always been an important part of my life ever since. I played a midnight mass up in Freeport, Maine, so I'm still playing. And I wasn't at the Brooklyn Tabernacle with you, but in any event, so that's kind of the music part. When I was in college, I studied mechanical engineering at Columbia University in New York City. And I was fortunate that I had the opportunity before I graduated, literally just the year before I graduated, to be introduced to the field of acoustics. There was a very gifted professor at Columbia who was an acoustics specialist like me. And so that was my introduction to the field. And it was sort of fortunate and good timing because I really didn't like engineering, and I didn't feel like I was good at it. And of course, my love was music, and I had given a lot of consideration to pursuing a career in music. But I was very worried about that because it's so competitive. And quite frankly, as much as I enjoy playing, I'm not really that good. And so sort of at the time I was coming to the realization that as much as I enjoyed playing music, it probably wasn't the best way to make a career out of it. I learned about acoustics, and it seemed like a great way to apply my my mechanical engineering skills that I had developed, and to sort of keep that connection with music. And music is an important part of what I do professionally. And so I guess, as they say, the rest is history.
But do you think, how does your specific knowledge and love of trumpet playing inform your work as an acoustic? I mean, does being a wind player have anything to do with the way you perceive or hear sound in a building?
Well, I think where it's most important is when we are working on a music performance space,
Mhm.
or and there are a lot of great sounding concert halls where the musicians are not necessarily happy on stage because they can't hear themselves very well. They don't hear other people in the ensemble. And that, of course, compromises the audience experience because the orchestra's not playing at their best. And uh, there are, a number of other acoustic specialists like me, but not too many that actually are practicing musicians. And so they may not fully appreciate what it's like. And certainly as a trumpet player, when I'm playing, it's so important to hear my own sound come back from the hall.
Mm.
And there are a lot of orchestras that play in theaters, and they have all these expensive acoustical shells and whatnot, but none of them really enjoy the experience of playing in that theater compared to a concert hall where they're in the same space as the audience. And the difference is that they don't hear that sound come back. And that's something that I think is difficult to fully appreciate if you're not a performer yourself.
When you say sound comes back, does that mean that you have to have it bounce off an architectural feature in the building? So that, I mean, is that a physical thing that happens with in order to get it to bounce back?
Yes, and so sort of one of the fundamental differences between a theater and a concert hall is that in a theater, certainly in a traditional proscenium theater, there is a proscenium opening that has a limited height and width, and that's very intentional from visual masking, so you can hide sceneries, or if you're doing ballet, and so the ballet dancers can run off into the wings and out of the view of the audience. But the problem for playing music in a theater is if you're playing behind that proscenium opening, the sound can only get out into the theater through that limited proscenium opening. And furthermore, that's the only way that sound from the theater can get back into onto the stage. And so it's very difficult in a theater to hear the sound that comes back from the theater. And of course, theaters are usually designed where they prioritize good sight lines. And so if you imagine standing on stage and looking out into a theater, you're looking into a sea of audience. And the audience, people absorb sound. So that sound is going out and getting absorbed. In a concert hall, if you go to a great sounding traditional concert hall and you look out onto the stage, you can see some of the audience, but you also see a lot of walls. And those walls are reflecting the sound, and that sound bounces off those walls and comes back onto the platform. And so you feel much more connected to your audience, and you hear that sound coming back. And it's a very important part of a great acoustics that I think it's important in order to appreciate the importance of that from the performer's perspective. It's really important to be in that situation. And as I say, I work on both sides of the
Well,
proscenium.
I lived in Netherlands for many years, and the famous Concertgebouw, the most famous
Yes.
example, has these great acoustics. And I remember what happened is it was built in the 1800s, had ornate balconies with all these sculptural features and balconies and so forth. And in the 60s, during that modernist drive, they streamlined and eliminated all of those features, and they lost a huge amount of sound. And they had to actually put back a lot of those kind of artifacts and sculptural elements in order to recapture the sound, which I found very interesting. But I guess my next question would be, do you think if you go to a theater that it has to use mics, that it's a failed acoustical experiment?
Not necessarily. I think amplified sound is just part of the culture. So you think about a Broadway style musical and everything is heavily amplified, but that's just the nature of the beast. And it's not necessarily bad, it's just different, right? I mean, I guess there were some very old shows where the singers were very strong and the orchestra played more quietly and they were scored in such a way. But you think about a lot of contemporary music, certainly rock music, starting right with the Beatles and groups like that, and all of that sound was amplified, and that's just part of the sound.
Yeah, but
And
sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so if you're playing, with a live acoustic drum kit, that the sound of the drum kit can very easily overwhelm the other instruments, but if they're amplified, then you can get a better balance. And so amplified and so much more, so many more performances today are amplified, and it's the expectation of the audience, of the performers and the composers. And so it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is different. And so if you take, for example, I remember when the new concert hall in Philadelphia opened, and it was designed for the Philadelphia Orchestra, but for whatever reason, they decided to open with Elton John. And you can imagine that didn't go so well. So because the acoustics to support amplified music are not, they're just different than, so the acoustics, what's good acoustics depends so much on the nature of the performance, whether it's a theatrical production or an amplified production or not an amplified production.
But, it occurs to me that culture plays a large role in this too, because as I mentioned, I lived in the Netherlands, and I remembered after being in New York for a couple of months and going back, my friend said, "Are you hard of hearing?" I go, "Why?" She goes, "Because you keep screaming." And I realized that my volume levels had changed culturally. And I wonder if that's something you run into, that there's a sort of different, the way, the levels at which we expect to hear things. I'm not just talking about whether you have hard of hearing impairment, but I mean, just as a general rule, are there cultural differences in the way we hear things and the expectations?
Well, perhaps, but I guess from my viewpoint, and perhaps I could be accused of being a purist, but I think some of our modern culture has lost the appreciation of silence and the power of silence. And but even in some of the I think about, for example, the show Rent, which is, it's a rock band, it's loud, but there are some very, very critical moments in that show where there is literally nothing going on stage, and that builds the drama and the tension.
Yeah.
And I remember the theater that it opened, when it opened on Broadway. It started off Broadway, and that theater had a very noisy air conditioning system, but they understood. Actually, we worked on the show. We helped the sound designer, and we worked with the owners of the theater, and we got them to turn their air conditioning system off for about 15 minutes towards the end of the show, when you got to that critical silence, in order to make that more impactful.
But actually, it occurs to me, is silence also something that you like? Because I imagine not all silence is alike in your design. Is that something that you consider a lot, as well as noise, when you're going into design? How to secure silence as well?
Well, it's maybe to go back a step, and when we think, to sort of describe what I do, what does an acoustician do, right?
Yeah.
So it's sort of a three-legged stool, and one of those legs is achieving silence. So that means working on the lighting system, the mechanical systems, anything in that theater, video projectors, anything that can make noise that's on all the time has to be designed to be silent in operation. And so that's one part of the stool. And then sort of related to that is sound isolation. And so you don't want to hear when the fire trucks go by, right? You don't want to hear when the plane goes over, because Murphy's Law would suggest that whenever that loud event happens outside, that's going to happen just at that super quiet, critical moment of the performance. And so we spend a lot of our time and effort making sure that a performance space is sufficiently isolated from outside, and also from other spaces in the building. In an educational facility, there could be rehearsal rooms, there could be, something going on in the lobby. And so we have to make sure that the performance space is isolated from every other space in the building, as well as from outside. And then the sort of third leg of that stool is how does the room sound, the room acoustics. And we sort of touched on that a little bit earlier, in terms of is it too live? Is it too dead? Are there echoes?
Mhm.
And that's, almost regardless of how, particularly any performance space, regardless of the type of performance, it has to be silent. The space has to be well isolated. The room acoustics, though, that's a little bit trickier because the room acoustics to support one type of activity may be a very different than to support a different type of activity. So it's in all of the projects we work on, it's very important to know how the building will be used, and if it's used for more than one thing, to understand how those uses are prioritized so it sounds best for what's most important, but that it has the flexibility. And we often design flexibility, for example, in the liveness of a space and how reverberant it is, that can be adjusted fairly easily. And that's something we often design into our spaces in order for that space to sound good for more than just one thing.
I don't quite understand what you mean by the liveness of a space. What does that mean?
So I guess one extreme would be singing. People love to sing in the show, right? That's a very live, reverberant
Got
space.
it.
And when you sing, you feel supported by the sound,
Mhm.
right? And there are other spaces where you speak and it's like the room is gobbling up the sound. And it just sounds, if you listen to music in a theater, for example, or if they're playing outside and you're not getting sound that's reflecting off the surfaces of the room, and you don't get that reverberation, the sound is sort of very dry and dead. And that may be the best thing for an unamplified dramatic presentation, but it's death to particularly choral music or music. Most music actually relies on the reverberation that's generated in the room, the liveness.
Yeah.
And that creates the bloom and the excitement, and you sit in a room and you feel like the sound is all around you. That's all of that is created by the room's liveness, which is sound reflecting off those walls, like in the Concertgebouw in Amsterdam.
So I recently moved to a new co-housing community. We share a common space, and we just spent an hour at our latest shareholders meeting discussing how we have to spend money on the acoustical panels, that it was a fail. And that the space, it's not for music per se. It's really where we have our meetings and our meals, but they're upset that it's way too noisy. And it occurs to me that like so much of your work probably isn't for the more dramatic, concerts and so forth. It might just be for everyday pedestrian housing, for example. And I just wonder, is that like a real consideration now when you're thinking about, a place to live, for example, or a restaurant or whatever, is how a sound gets absorbed in a room?
Well, in my opinion, acoustics should be, or a specialist in acoustics should be involved in any kind of a building that you're working on. And again, it depends on how that building is being used. And so the space that you're referring to may sound wonderful for chamber music, but if you're conducting a meeting, then all of that reverberation makes it
Yeah.
very difficult to understand what other people in the meeting are trying to say.
Well, but it makes me really, I'm sure they did it on the cheap, right? And they probably bypassed you altogether, your kind of field. I mean, do you find that happens a lot with developers, that they don't think your role is necessary, or do they are more likely to hire somebody like you, architects? Do you normally work? Yeah, I'm just curious how that works. Do you get a lot of developers trying to cut out that essential role that you have?
I don't think so. I mean, there's certainly plenty of buildings that get built or designed and built without the consideration of acoustics. And then if there's a problem at the end, they'll call us. But I don't think it's in an effort to save money. I think it's because they don't understand acoustics and they don't understand what determines a room's acoustics. And so we get involved too late, not because they're trying to save money, but because they don't appreciate the importance of acoustics in terms of how people will successfully experience the space. And then furthermore, they don't necessarily understand the connection between acoustics and architecture, and acoustics and and engineering and
And
engineering and
sanity,
mechanical systems.
also spiritual enjoyment and sanity, we're always seeking peace of mind, but we rarely consider this area, it's very interesting. I remember my first job out of college was working at a nature center called Nature's Classroom in Connecticut. And they would bus up city kids from New York to have a weekend in nature. And I would say to them, close your eyes and raise a finger every time you hear a new sound. And it took them like 10 minutes before they could hear one sound. They had become so immune to noise. It was very interesting. I'm sure you must run into all these kind of interesting cultural variations. Like, have you designed buildings all over the world? And I'd love to hear some like a great story about maybe something that even took you by surprise culturally.
Well, maybe this isn't the best example, but I think about thinking about my career path, and prior to starting Acoustic Distinctions in 1991, I worked for a firm that specialized in the design of performing arts spaces and concert halls and theaters. And so our focus was always on the performers and their experience and getting their sound from the performance platform into the audience seating area. And we didn't really consider the audience participation, because they weren't participating, or they were going and listening to the performance.
Right.
And then fairly early on into this day, working on worship spaces has become a very important part of our book of work. And we've gotten involved in many worship spaces, some very large ones actually. And particularly in this country, there are a lot of they call mega churches, but they build these huge spaces that are rival concert halls and theaters in their size. And so it was helpful in working on those kinds of projects, which I hadn't really done earlier in my career, and applying what I had learned designing concert halls and theaters, which was helpful. But there was another very important consideration, which was the congregation, and the fact that not necessarily in all, but in most worship spaces, the congregation has a very important role, and the acoustics should be designed to encourage the congregation to sing and to participate in worship. And that was a design consideration that didn't really exist in the theaters and concert halls we had designed. And so that was really important. And of course, it became more and more challenging as the spaces got bigger and bigger. And so we had one of the biggest spaces that I had worked on that was actually tremendously successful was Willow Community Church outside of Chicago. And they built a new 8,000 seat space, and it actually is fun to go there and worship, because there's this energy in the room, and it's not just a show, and it's very exciting. So we also more recently got involved in yet actually an even larger facility in India for an Assembly of God congregation, and they actually heard about us because of a church that we had done in this country, not nearly as large as theirs. And
Is it a Christian church in India, or?
Yes.
Interesting.
Very, very large, huge congregation. They're in the process of building a 20,000 seat arena.
What? I don't see how you could possibly design for that.
Well, it's very challenging, and this is something I had alluded to earlier. One of the reasons that the project we did at Willow Creek Community Church was so successful is because they had come from a space that was not very good, and they were always fighting it, and they didn't want to fight it. And so they got us involved at the very outset of their project. And so we started working alongside the architects from the very, very beginning. When we were when one of the worship leaders of this large congregation in India contacted us. They had already engaged architects. The design was fairly progressed, and it was actually not really possible for us to have a successful outcome. And they eventually realized that, and so we're not currently involved, which is it's sad, but again, that's why it's so important to be involved early. And it's something that, you know, going back, you mentioned the teaching, and it's something that's very important to me. Is, you know, hopefully I'm not at the end of my career. Hopefully I've got a long way to go. But I think in addition to continuing to be involved in these spaces, I think the other way that I can hopefully make the world a better place is to focus more on educating people about acoustics, building owners, developers, architects, engineers.
Yeah.
Because I think if they just understood the very basics of acoustics,
Yeah.
they would appreciate why it's so important for us to be involved from the very outset.
Yeah.
And we can actually achieve higher quality results at a lower cost. So it's win-win.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite building that you've ever been in? I should, that's kind of broad, but let's just say concert hall, that you feel like is a perfect acoustical masterpiece.
Oh boy. Well,
Or give me a couple of your favorites.
well, I'll one favorite certainly is it's actually a multi-purpose auditorium that prioritizes music, and so it can be transformed to put on large, you know, Broadway style musicals and grand opera. But their top priority is it's at the University of Northern Iowa. It's called the Gallagher Blue Dorn Performing Arts Center. It's been open now for about 23 years, and there is a local professional symphony orchestra in Waterloo, Iowa, and right next to where the university is. And so it's this sort of town and gown combined facility that supports both the local symphony as well as the music program at the university. And it was a project that we were involved with from the beginning. And one of the things that was so rewarding about it is that, you know, one of our core values here at Acoustic Distinctions is community. We love to be involved in projects that support community. And certainly this building has supported community since it opened 23 years ago. And I still remember there were people from the community that happily volunteer as ushers for performances. And I was out there for one of the first performances, and so whoever it was on stage had talked a little bit about the acoustics and asked me to stand up and recognized me. And during the intermission, one of the ushers came over to me and just asked, would it be okay if she could give me a hug? Because I had so enhanced her life in this community. She was just so thankful to have the space where she could go and enjoy hearing the local symphony play and to hear all of the performers play at the university. So that was really very rewarding. And they actually, the facility has been, so it was very challenging because as much as we had a very talented design team, there was a specialty consultant involved in estimating the cost of the building. And this cost consultant told us literally the day before the bids came in to build the building that it was on budget, and the lowest bid was more than 25% over the budget. And so we were forced to try to figure out how to reduce the cost of this building by 25% and yet not compromise the quality. And we did it. And it's been there, and it's been so successful that people come from all over to this facility instead of other facilities in Iowa. And they've had a great support from the community, and they've been able to raise enough money, you know, in times when people aren't going to the theaters, and they've just been so successful with this facility that they've been able to raise money to add back some of the things that were deferred initially that didn't impact the quality of the building, but the lobby's a little too small and there are not enough restrooms and things like that don't affect as much as the quality of the sound, but they're now going back and adding those things. So I've been able to go back out there and continue to work with them 23 years later.
It's beautiful.
And it's there's a lot of talk these days about sustainability and the importance of sustainable design. Well, that's a sustainable design. Here's a building that is continuing to thrive. They've had to spend no money to upkeep it, and it's still sounding great.
That's phenomenal. And it really is such a gift to the community, such a gift to the community, Hey, I can't believe that we're out of time. I don't know how this happened, but I'm fascinated by what you do, and I can't wait to follow your next steps. So I just really want to thank you for taking some time to share with everybody your very, very interesting world.
Well, thank you, Lisa. This has been a pleasure, and I hope it will be educational to everyone that gets to hear this.
To hear it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, David. All the best to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you for listening to The Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for The Brand Called You.